Welcome everyone in this room and also in the webinar. And welcome to the webinar, the EU-ETS price through 2030 and beyond, a closer look at drivers, models and assumptions. This webinar today is the conclusion of two sessions of very interesting debates that we had today, where the analytical community, the scientific community and ETS stakeholders joined forces and discuss their price forecast and the methodologies and assumptions that are behind these price forecasts. The webinar and also the workshops today are part of the Ariadne project, which is funded by the German Ministry of Research and Education. So thanks to that at this point. Before we start, I want to introduce everyone who's presenting today. From the scientific community, we have Orion Peffin from Enerdata. From Kobice, we have Robert Jeske. From the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research, we have Sebastian Osorio. And from the analytical community, we have today Yen Chin from Refinitiv and Mariko O'Neill from Bloomberg. And last but not least, myself representing ICIS today. In the workshops today, we were around 20 participants that are all experts in the EU-ETS, and they bring a variety of perspectives. And some of the results we want to present today. And co-organizer Benjamin Görlach from Ecologic Institute will summarize the findings that we had today. And then afterwards, all the price forecasting institutions and organizations will also have the opportunity to present their view. But before we dive into the details of the workshops today, I'm very pleased to welcome economist Professor Dr. Ottmar Edenhofer today in this webinar to set the scene. He's the chair of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change and also the director of the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. And I'm very happy that you are here today and will set the scene with your presentation on, why should we actually care about the EU-ETS? And its price in 2030 and beyond.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is an enormous pleasure to be here, and in particular to emphasize the importance of the EU-ETS and the price. And let me put this into a perspective. And I try to answer the questions why we care about the ETS price in 2020, 30 and beyond. Now, I would like to make 4 points. First of all, the EU's pathway to climate neutrality, which is a very important aspect. And here I will highlight the input of the scientific community. I will speak in the first part as the chair of the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. And then I will basically leave this position, this role, and will move on in my role as an economist. I will talk about Europe in the grip of the multiple crises, then the EU-ETS today and beyond 2030, and then I will conclude with a few takeaway messages. Now let me highlight the pathway to climate neutrality. And it is obvious that by mid of the century, we have to achieve net zero emissions. But it is very remarkable that the European Parliament and the other European institutions have agreed to set up a European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. And we should serve as a point of reference for the EU on scientific knowledge relating to climate change. This is in Article 3 in the European Climate Law. And what is our task? First, we have to consider and to communicate the latest scientific findings relevant to the EU. Then we have to provide scientific advice on the measures, the targets, the budgets, the coherence, and the commitment of climate policy or in the realm of climate policy. Then we should contribute to the exchange of independent scientific knowledge. We should identify actions and opportunities to achieve the European climate targets. And we should raise awareness on climate change and its impact. So in that sense, that's quite important. What we are doing now is we will provide very soon an input to the Commission on the criteria how to calculate the EU's carbon budget. So that's our first task. And for the next 4 years, we will try to fulfill this mandate. It is another confirmation that policymakers and decision makers in Europe, in particular in Europe, but also internationally, really rely on scientific input, and this puts a remarkable burden on our shoulders, really to provide not only excellent scientific research, but also relevant scientific research. And relevance means we put this in the context of the decision makers' problems. So now with that, I would like to leave my role as the chair, and now I would like to speak as a free man, which basically means as an economist. So what about the current situation? So the current situation, the invasion in the Ukraine had a profound impact on the energy market. And what you can see here is not only that the gas price drives the electricity price, but there is a remarkable, sharper or a higher growth rate of the gas price compared to the coal price. And this basically has incentivized investments in coal, and also the increase of the capacity of coal-fired plants around the globe. So the energy crisis has revived the coal market, and this basically has also a strong impact on the EU, because what we can observe is in the EU is also a coal revival, and this puts an additional pressure on the EU ETS. Here you can see basically we have a decline in the gas consumption, and compare to the 2021 baseline, we see an increase of coal consumption. So that's an important aspect. And you could say in the European context, we are lucky and happy that we have an European emission trading scheme, which has a given cap, and this will then translate into an increasing carbon price. Here, this is the adjusted cap, and this provides us a clear pathway to climate neutrality. And here you see the historical emissions and the EU ETS cap, and also the pathway until 2040. And this is quite remarkable because this defines the cap. And the commitment to the cap is, from my point of view, one of the most important cornerstones of European climate policy, and this gives us the trust that the other European member states at least stick to the European Green Deal. So this is not just about the cap, as Franz Timmermans said. In many ways, the ETS is front and center of all the efforts, and it is quite clear because the EU ETS, ETS1, provides a very tough compliance regime, a much tougher compliance regime compared to the effort sharing regulation. With its cap on emission, it is proven an effective tool to bring down the emissions. It provides a price signal to industry to switch to cleaner production. It drives also innovation, and very important, in contrast to many other policy instruments, it generates revenues for redistribution and reinvestment. Now, what is the implication? And this is quite interesting. The EU ETS1 price is an indicator for scarcity, but not only for the current scarcity, but also for the anticipated political development. And here you see a few political events, but these are historical events. And of course, the price responds to that. But also the investors anticipate the future scarcity. Now, the investors anticipate to a certain extent the future scarcity. And this increasing CO2 price made very, very clear that despite of the comeback, partial comeback of the coal, so in other sectors of the industry, emissions have declined. And I think that's a very important message. Now, the cap is a policy lever, but for decarbonization action, prices matter. And let me highlight three important points. First, the price is a focal point for the expectations of the investors. The achievement of the 2030 target depends on the current investment. And the current investment, to a certain extent, make long-term targets, long-term emission targets credible. So the ETS and the price is a source for revenues in green investments at the national and at the EU level. And it needs to manage the rising politics of carbon pricing. So there is a fundamental political economy issue on carbon pricing. And many people argue that high carbon prices are either not legitimate or are not acceptable from a social point of view, or policymakers cannot commit. What we see currently now is that obviously in Europe, policymakers have a commitment to the long-term target, and therefore there is some credibility in carbon pricing. So there is nevertheless, and these 3 points should highlight this, there is a need of knowing in advance how price will evolve, and therefore price predictions and future price trajectories are incredibly important for the investors and for the policymakers alike. Now, let me highlight say a few words about the expectations and about the price as a driver of investments. And here you see basically different price expectations and investment trigger, not by the current price, but the expectation of the future price. And here you see that the most investors expect for 2030 a price, a very high price above 100 euros per ton CO2. Nevertheless, the expectations differ widely, and this reflects the risk taking and the risk attitudes of investors. And the higher the expectations, the more likely the 2030 target will be achieved. So this is price trajectories and price predictions, and the expectations and the target are self-enforcing and a reinforcing mechanism. When investors do not expect scarcity in the future, the prices are low, the investments are low, and the lower investment make then future ambitious targets less likely to be achieved. The second aspect is the revenue part. The revenue part is enormously important, and revenues will peak with advancing decarbonization. But the question is when and how much. And this is not a big secret, which I will reveal today, that finance ministers do not like carbon pricing because of exactly this point, because of the declining tax base. But nevertheless, policymakers currently are very keen to use the revenues from ETS auctions, but it is up to our debate, or it's up to the future expectations. So what is the development of the auction revenues? And therefore, the price trajectories are incredibly important. The third point is the salience issue. And I have borrowed this slide from my colleague Michael Jakob, who is here today. And I think this slide reflects a very important insight. This is something which most of the time has been neglected, and this is the salience. So salience from a policymaker's point of view of policy instruments is incredibly important. So we had a time when basically the mitigation level was quite low. So then it was clear that the salience of the carbon prices was already high compared to the standards. And therefore, policymakers like standards because it allows them to hide a little bit the costs of mitigation. And this is the reason why many observers believe that carbon prices in the future cannot be implemented, because as soon as carbon prices make all the mitigation costs salient to the public, to the investors, and to the consumers, this might undermine the political feasibility and the social acceptability of this issue. However, I believe that in the future we will see that the salience issue becomes important in a way that it is no longer possible with other policy instruments like bans, like standards, to hide the costs. And therefore, carbon pricing in the future will become more important. And the more ambitious climate policy will become, I believe, the more important carbon prices will be, because efficiency issues will become in the future even more important compared to the past. So this is a little bit a logic, a political economy logic, which is in contrast what many people believe in the field, in particular our friends in the United States. But nevertheless, I think this is a very well taken point here. And I think the salience issue in the future works for carbon pricing for higher mitigation levels. So the last point I would like to highlight here is this is the commitment problem. And what does this graph shows us? The costs of climate policy are highly transparent. Nevertheless, transparent costs are a political problem. I do not deny this. And the problem is also when prices are not really credible and people form expectation about the prices, and they believe that the prices currently are low, and they anticipate that in the future the prices must be high because of very ambitious targets, and we have a hockey stick development. So this makes future ambitious targets less credible, because many investors might anticipate that in the future, when policymakers are confronted with such a sharp increase of the prices, they might relax the cap. And then this sends the signal to the investors to hold up their investments. So in that sense, this kind of hockey stick trajectory makes ambitious climate targets less credible. And therefore, it is quite important that investors anticipate to a certain extent already today a reliable carbon price. And it is also not a big secret that I am very much in favor of a minimum price, because the minimum price allows to do mitigation today and therefore makes future ambitious climate policy instrument more credible. So this is a safeguarding mechanism against the potential pushback through. The higher price uncertainty is necessary, and a corridor might provide such a commitment device, and this could also support future investments. So let me conclude with a few takeaways. So the EU's pathway to climate neutrality must be guided by independent and sound scientific advice. And this is not only an issue for the carbon budget, this is also quite important for the prediction of the future prices. And therefore, all of you are doing a very important job to form focal points for future climate policy. Despite of the short-term crisis, long-term goals must be sustained, and the EU-ETS cap plays a very crucial role. When the EU-ETS cap will be relaxed, this will be a fundamental problem for European climate policy and also for the investors. Carbon prices becomes more important as ambitious increases, and high information value is of analyzing future prices, because it drives investment, it is a source of revenues, and it is an indicator for political costs, and at the same time, it is an indicator for credible commitments of the policymakers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ottmar Edenhofer, for this valuable remarks. And I think it's a great setting of the scene. With that, I would like to hand over to Benjamin Görlach, who co-organized this workshop and will summarize the results and the findings that we discussed today.
Well, the great pleasure of trying to summarize 3 hours of really intense discussion in 5 minutes with doing everybody justice. But we, of course, will also have more takeaways from other presenters in a moment with these snapshots. One quick organizational remark, as being one of the co-organizers, just a reminder: if you have questions to what Ottmar has said or what I will be saying, what the other presenters will be saying, please do use the question and answer function in the Zoom, in the webinar. And also, if you don't have questions but like questions that others have posted, please vote them up, and that makes our life as the moderators easier when we get to the Q&A, to the second part of this discussion. So we spent the morning discussing basically what do we know about future carbon prices, how solid is our knowledge, how much confidence can we have in the predictions, and also in the functioning of our tools we use to predict carbon prices, given that we are living in extremely dynamic times. As Ottmar has also emphasized, that many things are changing at the same time, and that the tools we now currently use may not be fit for purpose under these different circumstances, or might deliver more uncertain results. And so in that sense, we compared different approaches and also looked at their merits in being able to deliver robust predictions. And one of the takeaways there, perhaps somewhat surprising, was that there does seem to be quite some agreement on the certainly on the price trajectories, as we will be seeing in a moment, for the medium run. So for 2030, that looks relatively aligned, but there are sort of more uncertainties about the way how we get to 2030, and of course also in the long term beyond. One of the factors that we did spend some time discussing upon already is the issue of companion policies or overlapping policies, and so what impact they would have on the price developments. And here I think some clear messages were that it's really down to the implementation of these policies, not so much the question what targets are set for renewables or for energy efficiency, but really on the ground how much change can be achieved. And that in turn is not only a question of regulation of these putting all these targets into regulation, but it's I think much more at this point also a question of can we get the investment going, and how sort of what is our expectation, how realistic is it to get these investments happening, given things like rising capital costs, etc. So there's quite some uncertainties on that ground as well. One takeaway on this dimension was also that, of course, in that way, price projections can help to show not only what needs to happen to keep prices under control, but also what could happen if we don't succeed on these overlapping policies. What might be the consequences if we then the carbon price has to do the residual work that remains. We discussed also on the question of behavior of market participants, how much we know about this, given that the industrial emitters will increase in importance as kind of the share of emissions in the EU-ETS, and whereas the behavior of energy companies, of utilities, is relatively well understood. There's more uncertainty about the behavior of industrial players, their market behavior, but also, I mean, there's increasing knowledge about their abatement cost curve as a determinant of their behavior, but that is still more of a black box than what it is for energy. And we finally also spent a good deal of time discussing how to bridge the short and medium term with the long term, and the question how, at what point, in what way does the end game of carbon pricing, the end game of the EU-ETS come into play? In what way is that being reflected already in our tools, and in what way do we need to integrate that more fully in pricing tools? We know that eventually emissions will reach net zero, but we know quite little about how that actually affects price expectations in the market. In the models that were shown and used, it has a limited effect simply because of limited foresight in some of these models to different degrees, but also the use of discounting. So the very long run does not enter as clearly there. So those would be some observations from this morning's discussion, but we have sort of more also, of course, the comments coming up from the colleagues representing the different modeling approaches.
Yes, thank you. Do we have the slides?
Yes, they are coming up.
Okay,
great. I just need to get them rolling. Bear with me in a second. So this is multitasking in the extreme. So just a second. Coming up now, the team slides. And now we're starting to share them. Good. And here we are.
Great. So yeah, I think in this chart we already see the overview of the different price forecasts that we discussed today, and we discussed a lot the underlying assumptions, and I think we want to give now every team at least the opportunity to justify their price forecast. And we start with Aurélien from Enerdata to present Enerdata's view also until 2025 and 2030.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I'll try to be brief and not repeat a lot of things that Benjamin summarizes very well in his introduction. First of all, just a couple of points on our model. Basically, we have different drivers of the EU-ETS price. Considering we will have a model that relies on energy systems modeling, we have obviously market fundamentals playing a big role in the evolution of our price trajectory. With up to 2030, mostly power sector playing a main role. But not only these market fundamentals with demand and supply equilibrium, we also have policy parameters such as design of the market, MSR, etc., that play a big role in the price trajectory, as well as interactions with other policies, as will probably be also discussed by other participants, and also behavior of actors. And as per main takeaways from the workshop, I'd say the first thought is that we have a lot of approaches with varying philosophies, basically, different types of models. I can, for example, cite the fact that not every model have an integrated view of the energy systems in their modeling approach. Yet, as was mentioned before, the price trajectories are somewhat coherent with each other, and we see some form of convergence towards the end of the period. So this is a very interesting point, and it shows that despite the variety of approach, there are some convergences there. And also, to repeat a bit what Benjamin already mentioned, the post-2030 issues have been widely discussed during the workshop, and I think it makes a lot of sense because all of us share. I mean, we showed a need to deal with these issues soon, and we already asked these questions, even if it's in the long run from today. But yeah, this summarizes my view, and I'll leave the floor to the next participant. Thank you.
So next up, Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They should be joined digitally.
Yes, indeed. So this is Mariko, and Mariko, we will need to oops. I hope you have been promoted to participant, to panelist, and should be able to speak now. No. See. Mariko, there she is. Okay, now you should be able to come in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I didn't think I'm able to turn on my video for some reason, but I can continue with just being unmuted. So yeah, one of the big price drivers in our model is the marginal abatement cost curve. And in terms of low cost abatement options for Europe until 2030, a lot of it comes from the power sector. We include updated fuel and commodity prices in our forecast, so we're a bit bullish towards 2026. However, our curve sort of flattens between 2026 and 2029 as more and more renewables come online that are in the pipeline. And of course, a fundamental driver is the declining supply, and this is reflected in policy signals of commitment to emissions reductions from the EU. And I thought what was very interesting in the workshop this morning, of the many takeaways, some of the ones that stood out were considerations of post-2030 evolution of the EU-ETS, and sort of increasing uncertainties around behavior of not only market participants, but also those of us who are looking to analyze the market.
Thank you, Mariko.
Okay. Next, we have Pick. That's Sebastian.
So in the case of lines, so what is mainly driving the price, so the model being or considering perfect foresight, then we have this medium and long-term targets. So this is definitely probably the most important factor. Not only the 455, but of course this, or we basically extrapolate the linear reduction factor, so the last certificates are issued by the end of 2030. And then we have also observed that their discount rates have a very, very strong impact And this is specifically because this changed the banking behavior, which have a strong influence on the MSR operation and the cancellations in the long term. And then what I have, or the main takeaways from this workshop, apart from this very interesting variety of inputs from the different models, I have to say that, yeah, one of the main issues is definitely the time horizon. So perfect foresight, I agree, is a very strong assumption, but at the same time, it's not clear to me what is the most appropriate time horizon for those considering limited foresight, and to what extent this could affect results. And then in the case of this of the prices, as I said before, that it was a bit surprising that they sort of converge by 2030. So it seems that somehow the models or the modelers have cleared that where we need to arrive or where we need to reach by 2030, but this lack of convergence in 2025 is showing that okay, it's not clear how to get there, or maybe to what extent these current policies or the discussion on everything around the energy crisis is having an impact on these short-term estimations. And definitely the overlapping policy seems to be playing a bigger role, at least what I expected based on the ICE's results, at least.
Yeah, it's Refinitiv.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Yen from Refinitiv. Yeah, as you can see, our forecast. So we expect EUA price to remain, let's say, around average 70 euros next 2 years, and then gradually rising. Of course, in the near term, next 3 years, we would still expect the market to be in the shock from the ongoing energy crunch, or as mentioned, the multi-crisis and slow down in economic activities. But we expect price to increase and approaching almost 130 euro in 2030. And why? So here I put in 2 main drivers, as we've noted also in our latest long-term EUA price forecast. It is really the EU's long-term climate goals. And also for the ETS is the declining cap, and also decline even faster under the Fit for 55 package. That is really supporting prices. And also I think it's built confidence among market participants. I mean, just imagine how many shocks this market has experienced as well. So yeah, that is we see the climate ambition is very important. And here also, I would also emphasize under the in the climate package, of course, REPowerEU, etc. There's higher renewables and energy efficiency targets, but we do see the market stability reserve is functioning, is really helping EU-ETS to tackle these external shocks. Yes, and of course, but what is setting the price towards the end of phase 4? We see an increasing role of industry abatement costs. And why? That is because we have faster deployment of renewables, and eventually even we have temporary coal revival, but will be faster coal phase out, probably hope in a few years time as well. So declining abatement potential in the power sector will really make industry abatement technologies costs really being the price setter and or being the participants' anticipation of future carbon prices. And yet we've had an excellent workshop, and the most important really combining both the scientific community and more from me and our team as market observer. Yeah, many topics, and I think we my takeaway is that one, foresight horizon, well as the larger CGE model or perfect foresight or CGE model or energy systems model would assume a perfect foresight for very long time horizon, or as our market simulation model, we would sort of try to predict, try to forecast the market price with the best information we have available, and also we update this information to make it as close to actual outcome as possible. So the approaches are different, but I think there are some similarity as well, as also been mentioned and by other model here as well. There's a convergence in prices in 2030. So I think there are some similarities too, but the difference in foresight horizon, I think it's important to note for one who just look at different carbon price forecasts. And second, more open question as of course model is a toolbox, and the model is model output is as good as your assumptions are. But of course, we can make a million assumptions to represent the reality. And here we note one is on investment decisions. So what if the investment or abatement I mentioned, they are not really being made in time, or at what level? I mean, well, we always hear the question, what level of carbon price can drive this abatement technology? What if this enterprise just don't take this decision? So I think it's a very important parameter for me as well to consider. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Next up, we have.
Let us see who we have next up. So this is the colleague.
Hello, my name is Robert Jeschke from KKBZM. We make this analytical work combining two modeling setup. One is simulation model for ETS with all the details and on a yearly basis, combining with the CG macroeconomic global model representing also regions within the European Union. And it was very interesting to see the results with the different model setups, both energy models, optimization, simulation models, and with different assumptions, which most are very complex. So, and at the same time, we see the changes in the prices before 2030, but in 2030, as was said, we see some kind of convergence. That means that the politically driven instrument, which is ETS, is giving us the answer that the price is rising at, even if you analyze this in different setup, the prices are still increasing with different speed, of course. But what from our perspective is the crucial driver for the price is this setup of the ETS, which of course one of the main issues is the linear reduction factor, which represents the target. But of course, MSR, market stability reserve, has a crucial role, and the setup of MSR, which we're still negotiating within the climate energy package, is a crucial point delivering the price for 2030. What is also important, which not mentioned on the slide, the CBAM, which will be introduced, and CBAM probably will have the increasing impact on prices because of the increasing the production of industrial sector in Europe. Another thing is the behavior of long-term speculators, which we also observe in the market recent years. Even before the war in Ukraine, there was huge interest in ETS as a market. So there are pension funds that invest for a very long time, 10, 15 years, that making these allowances not available for industrial and market players that are under the ETS. So it's very important to observe what are behaviors of market participants, because they will deliver also impact on prices. And mine takeaways, the main takeaways is this comparison of the different approach in modeling is very interesting, and gives a lot of another questions that we are raising during this workshop, but also giving some answers and point of view. And what is also very important is the assumption. So it was mentioned before from my colleague perspective that there is a policy overlapping, which is crucial for analyzing the development of the price in ETS, the cost of the capital, and the behavior of the market players, as I mentioned before. So I think these, from our perspective, these are the crucial, let's say, crucial points up to 2030, but up to 2050 is another discussion, because it raising question how we see the ETS as a main instrument after 2030, and what sectors we will include in ETS or exclude from ETS, and how we develop the global climate policy, because it's also interfere with the climate policy in Europe. So I will stop with that.
Thank you. So next one is myself, and I think I had already the impression this morning that we had almost to justify our less bullish forecast than the others. And what I want to note here, it's a real forecast, and we see price increasing over time. And however, I think what is to note here is that in the recent month, in the middle of the energy crisis, I think the ETS is in a very special circumstance, and the current price is also possible not necessarily only to reflect the long-term shortness of the market, but also the short-term tightness, especially in the light of participant behavior. And I think this is also where our model tries to capture these kind of imperfections of the models. We have an agent-based supply and demand model. We're really trying to translate policy in the market into numbers, into supply and when it's coming to the market, and also the interaction of the EU-ETS with other policies. And I think this was something where we had intense discussion this morning. We always ask the question, what happens without a CO2 price? And if we look at the power sector, I think there is an investment case into renewable energies, especially in recent days, even without a strong carbon price. I think it definitely supports, and it's required to really make the investment case, but we see this strong also government policy driven push for renewable energies. And I think that's a strong assumption, definitely, if you say we reach that targets in these sectors and we do sensitivities, also what happens when gas prices or coal prices do not reflect low emission costs. And here we also have sensitivities that go to 38 euro. But at this point, I think we also have to be careful, like how to short-term dynamics influence our long-term forecast. And overall, we also look at abatement cost. And for us, looking at energy efficiency measures and abatement costs in industry, we see they are profitable at moderately higher prices. And in the long run, I think, and this is something that we had as an outcome in this webinar today, we really have to look a bit after 2030, like how deep we really have to go and how fast, especially with decarbonization. And I think this is a crucial point to take into consideration, then also how that really interacts with supply and demand dynamics in the EU-ETS. Overall, I think we have discovered a lot of similarities. Some where, for example, how we model electricity markets, that there's an optimization on the electricity market side included in some of the models like ours. But some were different, especially when it comes to foresight. I think we have highlighted that already. And the last bit from our perspective, always important, is like market participant behavior really matters. And imperfections in the market need to be considered. And I think that really links to the question of foresight, like how much volume in the market can we really hold 10 years in the future, or how much money is there to do exactly that. Yeah, that's from my side. And I think we have,
I think E3M was still on the list, Alessia, but Alessia is not on the call, and so we will I think have to do with the system. She couldn't make it. She couldn't make it. Okay, she excused herself. Okay, good. So she's well excused. Greetings, Alessia, but sorry, can't be joined for this part of the discussion. But that means we have the rest of the time for questions and answers and a bit of discussion. And it's my pleasure to sort of relay some of the questions that were put forward in the chat and the question and answer. And then Florian will help me in sort of finding the right person in the room to give an answer to those. It is, of course, fascinating. We have the opportunity now to have a room full of people that spend their professional life making these kinds of price predictions in different ways using different tools. And I think this is sort of an enormous resource that you don't always get together like this. And so perhaps that just by way of encouragement for listeners to bring in your questions and keep them flowing, and we'll relay them on. In that spirit, I might sort of open with two questions posed by Dominique Lenné. One of them was, the observation that big companies, of course, also make their own price, have their own price predictions, form their own expectations, perhaps also use some own modeling tools if they don't choose to rely on sort of market analysts. And the question is, how does this compare? How does it relate to the science-based forecast? And so while Florian thinks on who could best answer this, let me throw in a second question related to the ETS2, the ETS for buildings and road transport that is currently being negotiated in this very city. And the question that will, of course, also have enormous implications for the personal lives of many of us. But what do we know about the price expectations there? What is the basis for the level of knowledge there, and how does it compare to the EU ETS price predictions? So let's perhaps kick it off with those first two questions, and then weave in more questions as they come along.
I think on the first two questions, I would imagine that probably the participants from the analytical community are suited to answer it. Yen, if you have a view on that, otherwise I'm also happy to take it, or Mariko for you as well. Okay, shall I take? Okay. So I answer, yeah, I can answer the question. I mean, we often speak to some of these bigger market participants, and I think often I mean, we understand ourselves in like supporting them also building their own view on the market. And I don't want to advertise anything here, but in general, I think what we see is also there are some forms of fundamental models. They have energy system model, I think, especially in the larger energy driven industries. They have energy system models as well that can, for example, calculate shadow prices. But also there's always a thorough modeling of supply and demand, and yeah, always a bit of a gut feeling on these philosophical question on foresight, for example. And I think the general take on this is that big companies also have a lot of foresight capabilities, and they are participating in the price formation in the market in the end. So I think the market price itself also is a reflection of that to some extent, or can be. Whether it goes into own forecasts, speaking for ICIS, not really. But I'm happy to take any any proposals how to do that, basically. But I'm not sure whether anyone else wants to answer that question. So ETS2. Yeah, Robert, over to you.
I can try to answer the question on ETS2, because this is a very interesting question, because from the perspective of negotiation process, ETS is still on the table. So it's not set up that we starting like the proposal from the Commission, a new ETS, and we look at this in the perspective that it's in place. But even from the perspective of an analytical point of view, up to 2030, the cost of CO2 reduction, because no one is predicting the market at the moment, because it's very difficult to predict the price of the CO2 in 2030, for instance, in new ETS, because it's totally new. Even European Commission has a problem. What would be the starting price with the new system? But when you compare it and do this, let's say at academic point of view, not the technical market-based assumptions, then you will see that the cost of the reduction of CO2 in 2030 would be quite comparable to the reduction of or a little bit lower than in ETS for stationary installation. But this don't totally change after 2030. So the cost of the reduction in the ETS2, if it stay as a separate sector, I mean, a separate ETS, that will increase enormously comparing to the ETS1. If you join this, merge these two ETSs after 2030, that means that the cost of the reduction in transport sector will go to the prices of stationary installations. So that will be the price should be quite higher than the estimation we are doing after 2040. Of course, we are now with the discussion, we are sticking to the 2030, but we managed to discuss what could happen further after 2030. So this was very interesting discussion among us here, and so I think this is open question of what would be if the market on ETS2 will start. So.
Yeah, one more thought from me. I think Robert mentioned a lot of points, and then you could simply derive it by calculating the marginal abatement cost, like you would it out of theory. But if you take into consideration what will be the trading behavior, I think one of the most important questions is whether participants would treat it like an allowance or would treat it like a tax. So it would be rather passive, saying, okay, we are not the ones to mitigate. We just pass this on at a fixed price, and we need to find some price, and there's maybe an anchor price, but we are not really actively engaging in that. And so that if they would treat it like a tax or a fixed price, then the logic of price formation would be how they would agree on this price. There could be some sort of price coupling, maybe to the ETS 1 even, but it's basically just crystal balling what this anchor price could be.
Then I would allow myself to bring in a few more questions. One I think wasn't explicitly addressed at Ottmar, but it smells very much like Ottmar is the one person to answer it, because I think it relates to a point you presented, questioning about the empirical basis why command and control measures have higher mitigation costs, or why pricing should be more efficient, and whether it should be rather seen as complements. And the question is how to use them effectively together. And while you ponder about what you might have to say on that one, a second question then again to the analysts in the room was coming from Julia Horn on the phase down of free allocation that we are observing in the EU ETS, and how that will influence the carbon price. In the comment, there were also sort of other questions about, you know, industrial trends playing out in different industry sectors. So give us kind of the picture of how do these different factors, Sibem has already mentioned, how do these different developments affect the carbon price. So those would be the two questions, and then perhaps Ottmar first on this issue of command and control versus pricing and how they play together.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Of course, my remark must came across that the usual economists' response to that, because economists are accused to be obsessed about pricing behavior. But this is not exactly my argument. First of all, what I would like to make first a theoretical and then an empirical argument. From a theoretical point of view, if more than one externality is involved, like R&D externalities, learning by doing, whatever, of course, then carbon pricing alone is not the most efficient instrument, because then you have to complement carbon pricing by other instruments. So this is a very profound theoretical argument. But this is well known. But if you have just one externality, of course, the carbon price is the most efficient way to do this. And it allows also to deal with distributional issues. But then the question is, okay, this is something which strange economists have figured out in their textbooks. But what about the reality? And here I could report a little bit on reality. First, we did two studies. One is an empirical ex post study where we figured out, so in the EU, which countries have been able to manage a structural break in the emissions in the transport sector. And it turns out that, of course, in all the countries, they have implemented policy packages. So this is, no single country says carbon pricing is the only instrument. However, the interesting point is all the countries, we found 10 countries with 7 successful structural breaks. All the countries have implemented in their policy package at least some profound pricing schemes. It could be a car tax, it could be a congestion charge, it could be some kind of carbon pricing. So this is the empirical base. It's a very strong argument. And the last thing, what I would like to highlight is that we did another study where we tried to understand what is the impact of a ban on the combustion engine to reduce emissions. And it turns out a ban on the combustion engine is only successful if it is complemented with a significant carbon pricing. And the reason is very simple, because the ban on the new combustion engine incentivizes, in the best case, building up the new car fleet. But what about the old car fleet, the old capital stock? the carbon price hits the old capital stock and reduces the lifetime of the cars. So this is a very interesting argument. And in Germany, the European our climate council, they published a report and arguing in a very interesting way. They said Germany was relatively successful to build up a carbon neutral or a carbon free capital stock, a new capital stock, but we were not successful to phasing out the old capital stock, the carbon intensive capital stock, and this was due to a lack of carbon pricing. So this is what I have to say. First, a little bit welfare theory, then a little bit empirics, and then also a little bit, let's say, common sense.
There was the question of free allocation.
Yes, I would also give Mariko the opportunity to answer that. Otherwise, I would just handle it.
Okay.
Okay.
Ahead, Mariko,
Yeah.
thumbs up.
Question on free allocation. I think from a fundamental perspective, it's easy to answer. It doesn't make a difference. It's supply in the ETS. But I think what it makes a difference is trading behavior, especially for those CBAM sectors that face international competition, that have long-term contracts for their final products, let it be steel or aluminum, and they hedge. They have to hedge their CO2 exposure. And I think one of the ways how we reflected CBAM is not only, let's say, that in the model breakdown, you see there is more in the innovation fund and less coming as free allocation. No, it's also that you see a little bit of hedging, or at least a phase-in of hedging from these sectors. Of course, this is all under the assumption that the CBAM will work as it was proposed. And I think in the discussion also, Robert from Kovice mentioned there's also indirect effects, let's say, of CBAM at itself, which is also linked to the free allocation phase out, which could be in a textbook case, for example, the increase of domestic production. I think that also depends on a few assumptions. I think the other could also be possible if, for example, CBAM is not implemented. But I would say from a modeling perspective, we try to do it with the hedging assumption on industry.
Okay, good. Then we can sort of bring in another round of questions. And there was actually quite a few comments and questions around the international dimension. And so one on the more optimistic note, there was a question earlier on to what extent we might be seeing some kind of linking to other international carbon markets, or more specifically, Joachim Hein from BDI had the question raised about Article 6.4 becoming operational in the not too distant future, and to what extent that is affected in the, or what are the assumptions in the modeling about these kinds of things happening. But then also, while we're at the international dimension, sort of less positive, more gloomy perspective, whether industrial relocation is factored into the modeling, and what are the assumptions about that. Industrial relocation, not so much understood perhaps as carbon leakage, where the jury is still out to what extent that's a really dominant factor, but I think much more in the current day, driven by high energy prices and eroding competitiveness that way. So what are the modeling assumptions about reducing industrial demand through that channel?
Anyone voluntary on the international question? I think Jan is.
Okay, thank you. Sure. I mean, I can directly comment on industrial relocation or more permanent relocation. Let's say in the base case EUA price forecast I've shown on the slide. So we have already we've used GDP forecast from Oxford Economics, which also aligned with the latest forecast from the European Commission, which are of course revised lower compared to the beginning of the year. And in addition, we've collected very extensive data of announced industrial shutdowns. There was certain percentage of capacity was temporarily shut in the energy intensive sectors, including fertilizer, steel, aluminium, etc. So we track those very closely. And I think these are reflected in our emissions forecasts, which are for this year and next year, which are also input to the price forecast. But as for permanent relocation, we have not factored in that. I think will, depending on the situation and also how energy price evolve in the next month or quarter, at least after this winter. But I think these are more certain part. If they are permanent relocation to, I don't know, Asia or America as such, this will be announced and we can track those easily by industrial data. Yes, so, but as in addition to that, of course, on linking, so many of you are familiar with me as I cover China ETS and China climate energy policy. And these questions I often get asked from Chinese audience as well, linking with the EU. I would say, yeah, of course, linking to massively large scale ETS, that's very hard. And the example is always how long it takes from link the EU ETS with Swiss ETS. But of course, we succeeded in the end. So, but it's not to link into very large national ETS, probably not likely before 2030. But the great point I'm mentioning Article 6.4 and even 6.2 as well. I think in the workshop, we've discussed a lot the post 2030 EU ETS setup. It's very important. So let me think the use of offsets and also under the Article 6 framework. And globally, as myself also I look at international abatement costs or international carbon pricing in different regions. And I've had the view abatement cost differs quite a lot across regions. In China, it would be switching from, let's say, improve your coal power plants efficiency, which is not in the EU. So I think in that, the abatement costs really determines probably the regional carbon price in the beginning. So yes, we have some, we are going to see some high price area and low carbon price regions as well. But this creates certain, I don't know, I think a lot of details need to be hammered out as we all following COP27 very closely and the outcome. But I think it's promising. There's probably more linking under the Article 6 framework in the next years that we can see more clearly. Yeah.
Essentially, just to add, so for me, one of the most important overarching findings in the morning was that also in terms of the modeling, and of course, also in terms of the actual system, we are seeing a fundamental change now. So in the past, the ETS had a very clearly defined border. It was the industry sector and the power sector, and no one really cared about the industry sector because it was dormant. So all you had to do was to look at the power sector. But now, given the relevance of the years ahead, and especially the consideration of ETS development post 2030, so it gets open on all ends basically. So you have to look into the industry sector. You have to consider a linkage, at least a financial one, with the new proposed ETS. You have to consider international interactions, either through Article 6 or maybe through something like ETFs or financial products that indirectly link. So it's open on all ends. And this is what makes it extremely challenging. And I don't think that in terms of modeling, we don't have good answers, but the modeling points us to the needs for the political discussion. So to follow through on that and not to be, to be in the, to lag behind and let the market decide on what the outcomes will be alone.
If I may add what Michael has good pointed out, that this is open on every ends. But this is very interesting to observe now that the political discussion is ongoing both in EU, and I think it's mostly goes outside of the EU. And Article 6 is a good platform for the discussion how you develop the market-based instrument around the globe, which is not happen in Kyoto Protocol and emission trading, which should be global. So we observe a lot of green investment schemes. As in Poland, we also had the green investment schemes with the selling the AIOs from the Kyoto Protocol limits. But I think we should also very much follow up the CBAM discussion and CBAM effects. We observed the European policy with aviation. So it was at first it was total disaster. So make it global aviation under the ETS in Europe, and at first it was total disaster. But at the end we find out that we have a CORSIA. So we have another global agreement which is focused on international aviation. We can argue which is good or not. There's a lot to improve, but we at least we don't have only a climate convention and Paris Agreement. We have another global agreement which is focused on greenhouse gas emissions. And I think CBAM will deliver as well different solutions that we are not seeing nowadays. For instance, if you see that the CBAM is generating the discussion within the sector, so like steel sector, which is energy intensive sectors, like there are talks between EU and US on agreement with steel production. So I think it's evolving in different ways that we are not observed before. So I think it's from the analytical perspective is very challenging because it's you have to look at as well on the sectoral level, not only on the carbon pricing as it is, but on the sectoral level. And if you look at the linking between systems, of course, technically it's possible, but the results would be politically not agreed. So I think we also got in Europe the carbon farming idea, which is European Commission will propose the technicality of calculating the emission and inventories of this emission on reducing emissions. So I think this opened also doors for this negative emissions market. And if we look at the negative emission market, then we also look at the offsetting emission or linking between others, let's say negative emissions market around the globe. So I think there are a lot of things happening from the market perspective. So there are voluntary markets that are evolving, but at the end, if we want to make a change, it should be under the supervision of administration on global perspectives.
And then I would sort of again relay two more questions to the collective wisdom of the experts here, relating both to assumptions that were made in developing these forecasts or these scenarios. The first one was about inflation. So what's the assumptions about inflation in these scenarios? I would guess that's not only, I mean, are these real or nominal prices, but also what assumptions are behind that about energy prices, etc. And the second one also relates to sort of assumptions about fast-moving factors. We're a stone's throw here from the Berlaymont, and as mentioned, the Fit for 55 negotiations are ongoing in the different dossiers. So do these scenarios, what do they take as a departing point? Is it Commission proposals? Is it the Parliament's proposals? Or is it your expert guess as to what might come out? So where do you position yourself, and how might your forecast change if the proposals change?
Probably we all have to make a short statement about that, so I maybe would make the round here. So I think the first question was on the assumptions on inflation, real or nominal. The second one was on the factor Fit for 55, exactly, EU and policy assumptions. Thank you. So I would start then with who wants to start? Mariko, Yen?
Yeah, I'm happy to start,
Okay.
given that mic is attached to my headphones. So in terms of inflation, the price forecast that we provided was nominal, and we have included in our model inflation assumptions that you can change to what you think. Our baseline just comes from the Bloomberg terminal, and yeah, that can translate the forecast into real prices, should you wish. And then in terms of policy, as for the Fit for 55 package, most of the parameters included are according to the Commission's original proposal from July 2021, with a couple of exceptions. So maritime is phased in 2024 instead of 2023, just because of how slowly things were moving. And in terms of Repower EU, this was slightly trickier because the Commission's plan came out in May, and then several other ones came out in October, and there was quite a big difference between them. And so our base case model includes the council's plan, which was to raise 25% of the 20 billion target from front loading, and the remaining 75% to be taken from the innovation fund. We also include a few scenarios for how these parameters could change things. So both in terms of Fit for 55, but also Repower EU. And so, yeah, you can sort of adjust the model to see how this would affect the price, but the base case that we gave are those assumptions.
Jan, you're next.
Yeah, same on our UA price forecasts are nominal. And on inflation, of course, we've always used the ECB policy target, but we all know the actual inflation is definitely higher than that. But I think that is more or less be tackled by one. We've calibrated prices very close to delivered market prices. And second, on energy prices, we always use the latest forward curves, which are for coal and gas prices almost going to 2030. So I think that is sort of reflecting the inflation hedge or what we observe in commodities markets as well. Yes, and yeah, then on policy, I think similar to others on the Fit for 55 package on linear reduction factor and one-off rebasing. And yes, and in our October UA price forecast, we've included the sales of UAs from under Repower EU, and which I think I should emphasize, we've assumed given the average UA price of 72 euro, so which means to restitute the funding needed. So we have assumed close to 200 million tons additionally will be offloaded.
Thank you. So on our side, at the data, we only use real values, so we don't really take care of the inflation issue, which makes our life easier these days. And as per the assumptions for the scenario, so to be honest, we tried several sensitivities with different configurations. The one we showed here is basically aligned with the Commission proposal pre-trilogue, basically. With the Commission's cap and the Commission's parameters for the MSR, etc. And just a note, we didn't include explicitly all of the policy overlap with the renewable energy efficiency targets. And I would like to point out that in the several tests and sensitivities that we did, both these overlaps with policies had a huge impact, as could also be seen with the ICIS trajectory that was described by Florian earlier, but also obviously the ambition of the cap in the proposal of the Parliament compared to the proposal of the Commission. That's quite self-explanatory, but also the design of the MSR, which could have a very large impact on the price. So just to mention that the current trialogue brings a lot of uncertainty on the projections that we showed, and the base case we sent is more illustrative in a sense.
And in the case of lines, we also went through for the easy option, real prices. In terms of policy or everything related to the Fit for 55, so we assume basically the numbers that are right now in the Commission proposal, so for MSR parameters and for the targets in 2030, then we just extrapolate this cap. And for other variables, we also play with different sensitivities of fuel costs. The capital costs are in line with most of them with the Commission. We take sources like the last reference scenario and the asset report, which I think is actually the same. And then other parameters, in terms of demand is also different studies, and but it's also in line with the Commission, at least in the medium term, 2030 or 2050, there are higher variations, I think.
Yes, on ICS side, we have a real forecast. All our assumptions are real and not inflation adjusted. Yeah, and on the aspect of policy, we are closely monitoring the process, but so far we think the Commission proposal is the most likely outcome. And this is what we model at the moment. We did a slight adjustment this year in September, when it became more likely that actually there will be some form of an intervention light in the market, so some form of front loading, extra supply in the midterm. And we have adjusted that by front loading 250 million allowances, partly via the Innovation Fund, partly via the cap. And so we see more supply in the midterm, less supply in the long term, and that's reflected. We have some policy scenarios also reflecting the upper threshold change that is currently still on the table, as well as the more ambitious cap by the Parliament, which leads to higher prices in the long term. So let's see in the next weeks what comes out of the discussion. Yeah.
So in our KKBZ modeling, we also use real prices. The all macroeconomic data are based on input-output database from GTAP and evaluated by the European Commission from the GECO database, and we also use projections from Primes 2020, which is means that we haven't calculate or use the data with the higher energy prices that we observe now, which from our perspective will have an impact on EUA prices and lowering them down. But at the same time, we also didn't calculate the from technical point of view, we calculate all the technicality of ETS and MSR parameters as well. All the funds that are in ETS and in the proposal of European Commission, we haven't calculated the Repower EU and borrowing up front load allowances from the second part of the period, which from the perspective of price development, we should at least somehow lower the price up to 2025, but instead increase the prices up to 2030 after 2026. And I think that's it.
Good. Then I would suggest, with a view to the time, but we can sort of throw in the last two questions that are still up there, and both related to kind of industry behavior and the behavior of the covered entities in the ETS. The first one relates to banking and what assumptions are about the banking behavior. Is there going to be more? Robert Pietzka asked, greetings, Robert. Do we expect to see more banking or less in 2030? And for instance, picking out on the ICES and the relatively lower carbon price path, could that be due to companies using up their banked allowances? Is that something that would play in and perhaps explain part of the difference to others? So assumptions about banking, and the second one is assumptions about investment behavior. So higher carbon prices, of course, would then incentivize investment into emission reductions, which in turn will decrease the carbon price. And so do we see that, how does that mechanism work, and could it even lead to some kind of oscillation of the carbon price path? So what would be your take on these questions? ICES was singled out. So.
Yeah, probably I have to answer first. So yeah, we take assumption on banking and we transition from a use of banking rather to a hedging approach for industry. But overall, in terms of what the industry holds in terms of allowances and also what the power sector holds, I think that's the more obvious one. We're coming to a lower volume in 2030, a much lower volume. I think that's relevant also when it comes to the interaction with the MSR. But yeah, probably one would have to compare these assumptions. We haven't done that today, but I think there's a lot of ground still to cover. But I want to also give others the opportunity to answer that question.
Robert, please.
Okay, so from our perspective, we did this sensitivity analysis on banking or hedging behaviors in a simulation. So we put regular, let's say, banking up to 4 years, like it is observed nowadays. But of course, the changing the parameters, increasing the target will for sure change the behavior of market players. And we observe another market players that are coming to the market, which are investment funds that are gathering the allowances just to have a profit in longer term. That means that there would be less allowances on the market for installation that will drive the price, could drive the price if it happens. So that is why it's very important and crucial to observe the market from the fundamentals perspective. And this is a job for the ESMA or the Commission. But at the same time, I think what is also important that when the price development will be fast, so with the increased prices, we will observe a huge increase in prices, then the behavior will the behavior that the, let's say, banking will be lower because of the less money in the portfolio for industrial sector to invest in many years up front, and then instead they will cover the emission on a yearly basis. So this will probably change if the development of the price will be fast.
I think there was a point also from Michael.
Yeah, so it's on the banking and banking versus hedging point. I'm asking myself if banking is not really a phenomenon of the past as we look into the future. So for me, I mean, it's an economic terminology for allowances not used, but I think our understanding is that is sort of hoarding by industrials of the allowances they got for free, and I think they're increasingly running short on that. They will have to buy that anyway, and if you buy that, you probably do not buy it to bank it. I mean, not to do anything with that. So it's also implies a substantial change of the spirit and mindset. So I think anything will be hedging, will be well thought through. And then the question is if there will be, I mean, trading strategies like buy and hold, I mean, from other actors. So I think we really have no clue about what the allowances in the market will be, who will be the actors who hold them, and what their intentions and trading strategies will be. And I think we are undergoing a fundamental shift here. And so the question is not how much banking there will be, but what sort of banking, what sort of holding actually will be there, especially as we move forward.
Thank you, Michael. I think there's a last question.
Yeah, we've pretty much exhausted the questions from the audience, I would hope so. And many thanks for great questions, but to perhaps throw in one last question myself, since we have honor of having Ottmar Edenhofer here, who's worked in sort of making carbon pricing possible in different functions, advising different governments. One of the discussions we had earlier was this question of, you know, what's the future of the carbon price in the medium to very long run going to be? And, you know, the last couple of allowances, will they be traded at zero cost or at very expensive cost, thousands of euro or nothing at all? Not asking you to make your prediction for the carbon price in 2040, but perhaps just more tactical, strategical. Would you say that we should rather put our bets into making political systems, weatherize them so they can actually deal with very high carbon prices through, you know, compensation mechanisms, etc.? Or would you rather put your bets on all these additional companion policies to make sure that carbon prices actually don't have to be all that high because other tools are doing part of the work, and so also sort of a lower carbon price which would be effective? So what would be your sort of preferred strategy between the two?
Yeah, first of all, that's a very interesting question, but let me start with the endpoint problem, because many people think when we basically have achieved carbon neutrality, so then basically the job of carbon pricing has been done, right? So that's one of the main conclusions, and I strongly disagree with this. And I would like to explain you why. Because from my point of view, if you want to achieve carbon neutrality, this is nothing more, nothing less than a kind of a comprehensive, consistent industrial carbon management or carbon cycle management. So think about the following. Synthetic fuels. So for synthetic fuels, you need either CO2 from biomass or from the atmosphere. biomass, it's very limited. So I think you need some kind of CO2 from the atmosphere via direct air capture. If you want to avoid that for synthetic fuels, basically the CO2 is used from burning fossil fuels, you need a very high carbon price to make this competitive, because synthetic fuels are very expensive, and if you need this for the airplanes, so you need for, I would say not forever. I'm with infinite forecasts. I'm a little bit. I want to be careless about talking about the infinity. As a former theologian, I know infinity is a very very difficult concept. But what I would like to say, for a very long time, carbon pricing is needed, even if we have achieved carbon neutrality. And this is very, very important, because we have to manage negative emissions, and also we have to manage the whole carbon cycle for a very, very long time. So that said, but this is a different question. Then the question is complementary policies via carbon pricing. Here I would like to argue the complementary policies are not costless at all. They have also done some costs. And if you look at some of very famous models calculating low carbon prices, and you look at the model results, you see basically they have strong assumptions about energy efficiency. But is energy efficiency a costless thing? No, it's not a costless thing. You have to invest also. And the thing is, I believe that in the future, for the next decade, the salience issue becomes more and more important, because the salience of the costs of the other policy instruments will come on the table. And efficiency in the past was not so important, but efficiency for this very, very ambitious goals, we will realize over the next years how ambitious these goals are. Efficiency will become very, very important. And this has to be complemented then with some kind of compensation mechanism. I deeply believe this is also a big issue for a long time. And we are very well advised, if we use the current gas price crisis as an entry point for a very long time in enduring compensation schemes. I would say, for me, the compensation schemes are absolutely crucial. Whatever we do on, let's say, on this kind of Pigouvian pricing, be it the congestion charges, and I deeply believe we will have also a debate in the transport sector on congestion charges. You can only implement congestion charges if you compensate the low-income households. And I would even argue that it should be crucial that whenever states use some kind of Pigouvian pricing or Pigouvian taxation, they commit themselves to recycle the revenues to the citizens, because otherwise I have serious doubts that we will succeed. And then you can say, yeah, okay, but carbon pricing or Pigouvian pricing is not a good idea. We have bans and we have all other things, but bans are also quite costly. Think about the bans on combustion engine. So this might hit poor people in the city very hard, and I could imagine that this could lead to some kind of unrest. And if you can combine this with carbon pricing and compensation schemes, you're in a much better position. So by and large, I don't bet on a specific price trajectory. I'm not in the capacity to do this, and I'm quite careful here. But what I would like to say, carbon pricing will, for a very long time with us. Last thing, if we are serious about negative emissions, then we need negative carbon prices, right? So we have to subsidize the negative, because we have to compensate the people providing the negative emissions. So carbon pricing is with a negative sign will be also with us for a very long time. And the amount of money we need for a very, very long time to incentivize this technology is also. This is, I would say, the price of managing. What we are doing with carbon neutrality is we are committed to manage parts of the carbon cycle in a very intentional, decisive way. And for that, we need this toolbox.
Good, thanks a lot. I think we can, thanks a lot for everyone to participate also in the webinar here. I think it was a very fruitful discussion today. Thanks Thanks also to Ottmar Edenhofer for the very interesting thoughts on the future of carbon pricing. And yeah, with that, I think we can close this webinar. And yeah, probably we'll see you all and also the digital audience in some form or another in the future.
Many thanks. All right. Greetings from Brussels and all the best.